Good afternoon. I'm Harriet Hamasi, University Librarian at Brown, and I want to extend a warm welcome to each of you. We would be much warmer if we were outside. Many of you know this set of programs, which included an exhibition, a recital, and a symposium, were all intended to happen on one day when it was not warm. It was very snowy. And the university was closed. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to have heard John play his recital and to have observed the exhibition, which is still on display in the John Hay Library. I believe we'll have a reception in the Hay after this program, so I hope you'll just walk right across the street with us and enjoy seeing the exhibition and also having some refreshments. I want to begin by extending a word of appreciation to Professor Tony Bogues. Tony is the Asa Macer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory. He is also the director of Brown's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And Tony has organized this afternoon's symposium, and in just a few minutes he'll give an overview of the topics and also an introduction to the speakers. But first I want to share with you a bit of background, I'll be brief, about this program and the accompanying exhibit that we hope you'll see in the Hay. More than 2 years ago, I received an email message and then a phone call from Tom Tisch, who was chancellor at the time. And Tom had forwarded me a proposal of sorts, I guess, from John. And that proposal outlined really a fabulous possibility for Brown and for many other institutions of cultural memory and history and other higher ed institutions as well. And John's proposal was that there would be an exhibition of some materials that he owned, including perhaps some of Brown's materials, a recital that he would perform. And as it later turned out, we invited some of the Brown students to join in that performance, and that happened several weeks ago. And he was also interested in having a symposium of sorts to talk about the reason that this music is important and that this cultural heritage is so important. It turned out that John came to campus, I think on one of his many visits to his parents, which is wonderful that they live in Providence, and John could visit frequently. And during one of the first visits that I met John, we included several faculty members, one from the music department. At that time it was Butch Rovin, now Dana Gooley, who is the chair of the music department. Tony Bogues was part of the discussion. Christopher Geisler, who's director of the John Hay Library and Special Collections, was part of the discussion. And we began to plan out what this program might be. Almost 2 years later, it's been a great opportunity to see the evolution of that program and to hear the many comments and contributions of each person, and today to be culminated in the symposium. As I was thinking back over this 2-year period and what I personally have drawn from the planning process as well as the wonderful exhibition and John's playing, and then in anticipation of today's symposium, I thought that this whole set of programs is about tracing memory, tracing authorship, audience, agency, and also meaning. This tracing is derived from both printed and unprinted text or scores. I think probably much of the music that you play, at least originally, was probably not written down. Is that correct, John?
Most of it was actually written down because these were classical musicians and they made money via selling these scores. But
perhaps the tradition from which they
Yeah, and they were
emerged.
transcribed after their composition because some of these
Exactly.
people were blind, actually, so.
So that led me to one other tracing, and that is of the seen and the unseen object or condition in which this music might have been played, as well as the heard and unheard performers and audiences, because certainly audiences had a big impact on the response and perhaps even the initiative of performers. And I think, John, you might say that is still true. I recall that you were standing and talking, and the kind of response that you must have felt from the audience. I mean, we were all very engaged with not only what you were playing, but also what you were telling us, and also the visuals that were on the big screen. So it's with these thoughts and thoughts that will occur to you as this afternoon progresses that I welcome Professor Tony Bogues, who will introduce this afternoon's program. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Harriet. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really very glad that we are finally able to do this. It's been it's one of these events that if everything could happen and anything could happen, it would happen. And when we finally thought we all had it together, I got a note yesterday saying one of our panelists who had stuck with us all this time, in fact was the very first person I asked to do this, Eric Galat, who's a professor at CUNY, wrote to say he was not feeling well, and he was going to try to come, but he was not so sure. And then this morning we got a note to say he was not going to be able to come. So, but at that stage, you know, we had to press on. So I want to apologize for Professor Lott, who is not well and not able to make it. If I'm allowed to frame for a few moments this particular symposium, I would like to begin this way. There are two young, relatively young African-American musicians, critics, and cinematographers. Their names are Arthur Jaffa, who is the cinematographer for Daughters of the Dust, and now a noted filmmaker, and Greg Tate, who is perhaps one of the finest music critics on black music that we have in this country. And they have been talking to each other as friends for some time in New York City, and as colleagues working within a certain tradition, and trying to think about the meaning and what Greg sometimes called the power of black music. And there's a recent article which they both published, in which they talk about that one of the power of black music, they say, is a certain kind of alienation, and that it is out of that alienation that the music develops a certain power. And I would argue that there is within black expressive culture, generally in the United States, a certain kind of power that comes from that kind of alienation. Historically, we should recall that there was a historian, he wasn't here, he was down the road, in another university, John Balamis Gay, who made a set of collections of slave narratives, of 19th century slave narratives. And in doing that, opened a certain door for us to think about African American expressive culture writ large. It's certain kind of distinctiveness. And when he says distinctiveness, and I use the word distinctiveness, we're not talking about any kind of essentialism. Rather, one is trying to think about how expressive forms, and in this case, musical expressive forms, grow up, are adapted, rework themselves, and then become something else, become something new. In the period of, I would argue, period of American racial slavery, the kind of music that emerged out of the African American experience, out of the experience of slavery, was a music, I think one can say, characterized by something called remembering song. That is a song around questions of memory, what it is that we may have forgotten, what it is we may have lost, what is it that we may find ourselves in this place that some people consider to be a land of exile. If you remember one of the spirituals of Exodus and the centrality of the Bible to what Du Bois would call the sorrow songs of the African American. And therefore, this business of trying to remember, of translating what I would sometimes would call memory into sonic sound, and in translating memory into sonic sound, creating a certain kind of distinctive music, what Du Bois calls in Souls of Black Folks the gift to American civilization. Then, of course, we have in that period right before the end of slavery and the Civil War, we have the songs really being and the music really being sorrow songs, hymns, with the major work actually being a man called John Turner Layson, who produced the hymn book of the African Methodist Church. In the secular domain, if you could call it that, you had a whole host of people who were writing songs and who were making music. And John Davis talks about a man called James Monroe Trotter, who was seen as an African American who was seen as one of the major music critics around, what we would call music critics today, and music historian, kind of musicologists, some of us would call it. There's a whole set of issues around him because he was a man who wanted to put African American music on what he called a scientific footing and wrote in that kind of language, while there were people who say no, that when you do that, what you do is that you miss the richness and the complexity of the music itself. The point I'm making here, and the point I think John makes and the exhibition makes, is that there's a very long history of black music in this country. And that it is, when those of us who are, my generation with gray hairs and so on, will think about soul, or will think about the later, rhythm and blues, music coming out of Chicago, music coming out of Philadelphia, and then would also think about the music that comes out of New York later on in the 90s. That is hip hop. But I think that once you begin to understand that there is a set of conditions, the music has a long history, then one question that emerges has got to be, what are the conditions that produce this music? In other words, there is a whole set of argument about not just the music as a certain form of expressive culture, but in what kind of conditions would produce this kind of distinctive music. And you can't therefore think about African American music and its long history without not thinking about the ways in which it has been produced, the conditions that have actually produced it. And it is those conditions, I think, that some critics and some writers would argue that gives the music a certain distinctiveness. And in fact, some people I know periodize the music according to the actual conditions themselves. Some of us would say you can't have that kind of heavy overdetermination, but that there is a relationship between the actual music and the conditions for its production. And I would then want to say that it is in thinking about this and thinking about some of the work that John does and the exhibition, that you then you can't escape this business now, not just of the music, but of minstrelsy. And the way I would suggest we might want to think of it, and I'm sorry that Eric is not here because he has written extensively on this, is really to borrow a term from Eric, which is to think about minstrelsy as a kind of racial unconscious, a racial unconscious of American society. And what does it mean to have that racial unconscious? And what I think he means is not that you are unconscious of race, but is that in fact you don't mention it as as minstrelsy, as minstrelsy grows, emerges, and as we see it. So I think if you put all those things combine all those things, you get a kind of combustible tinderbox. And that is all to the good, because music is in fact perhaps one of the most profound sonic and emotional experiences that we can have as human beings. But I think that part of that tinderbox, the combustible tinderbox, if you want to call it that, is that it always takes us back to the conditions for its production, because it is human beings who make these things. And the question that I always ask myself is, what is in the conditions that makes a human being does A, B, or C? And how can we think about those conditions, and how do those conditions relate and shape what it is that people do? So that I think that those are some of the issues as I read them, both in the catalog and in the exhibition. And that, some of the speakers might try or will address in some shape or form. So let me introduce the speakers. First will be John Davis. John Davis is a pianist, curator, and I think I can say with some pride, Brown alum. This was not in the bag of forgiven, but it's clear to me that one has to say that. One is on Brown's campus. Whose work is associated with many concerts in the United States and abroad, essentially around 3 critical acclaimed recordings, or begins with 3 critical acclaimed recordings on the Newport Classic. John Davis plays Blind Tom, and this particular figure, I'm sure he will speak about, is a really critical figure. One was hoping to get Daphne Brooks here, but who has written extensively, but she's not able. She wasn't able to come. A top 10 seller in the classical music and Tower Records, and on Amazon. He also has done the Marshall Field Tornado. John Davis plays Blind Boon, 2008, a repeat #1 seller on the Ragtime chart at Amazon.com. And Halley's Comet, Around the Piano and the Mark Twain of John Davis, 2010, a CD of Twain's related compositions, which according to the New York Times was played powerfully and with a rich palette. At the core, I think, of Davis's work is really his own personal archive of rare 19th and early 20th century printed African Americana that is the source for many of his ideas and materials that have filtered into his concerts, recordings, and various literary contributions, including things in American Lives, and the African American National Bibliography, and Stress and Coping in Autism, all published by Oxford University Press. He has been interviewed on the right station, so to speak, NPR, ABC, and PBS, and then did a program-long film interview on ABC's Nightline close up. He has also been profiled in many newspapers, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Oxford American, the Independent in London, and Scientific American. And that last one I kind of wondered why.
Me too.
Remembered Trotter's attempt to make the music scientific, so he can probably talk about that a bit. Brandy Monk, Dr. Brandy Monk Payton is currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Leslie Center for Humanities at Dartmouth College. She is associated there with the Department of Film and Media Studies at Dartmouth. She obtained her PhD in Modern Culture and Media at Brown, where she was a Ford Foundation dissertation fellow, and so this is a Brown panel, and a lot of Brown alum, Brown and Brown graduate fellow. At Brown, she was a graduate fellow at the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and her own work is on questions of race and representation, and has been published in a couple of journals: Black Scholar, Reconstruction, Studies in Contemporary Culture, and Feminist Media. She's currently working on a book project called Dark Optics: Blackness, Exposure, and Celebrity in Media Culture. And in fall, in a couple of months from now, 2017, she will be an assistant professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University. We are very proud of her. And I am proud of her since I sat on our dissertation committee. So each of these persons will speak for about 25-30 minutes, and then the floor will be open to Q&A. Thank you all very much for coming, and let's begin with John.
Thanks so much, Tony, and thank you and welcome everyone. And thanks for coming. Bambula Black Music Before the Blues comes at a particularly fraught moment in American history, with the Black Lives Matter movement still simmering after Barack Obama's 2 terms in office and the most racially charged presidential campaign in recent memory. This exhibition is a survey of the African American roots of popular music and show business in the United States. On display are printed artifacts of the shared African and European-based musical tradition established in colonial America, a cultural synthesis that continues to shape our nation's identity. These first flowerings of the transoceanic dynamic triggered by the African slave trade, often referred to as the Black Atlantic, played a foundational role in the development of jazz, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll, and initiated a set of structural parameters and comedic archetypes that have become hallmarks of the American performing arts in theater, film, radio, and television. The scholarly framework from Bambula, Black Music Before the Blues, can be traced to the cross-cultural forces at work in the material being shown in the exhibition, as well as to the evolution of my own identity, one shared consciously or not by many Americans. My lifelong interest in African American music and culture was kindled when I was just 10 years of age, literally just up the street from where we are currently meeting. One day, my older brother, Ned, he's a less cute one on the right, now medieval Chinese historian, but still a bluesman to the core, brought home this record album, still in my collection today, entitled More Real Folk Blues by the late but still great Mississippi bluesman, Sonny Boy Williamson. The moment helped me, the album's opening cut first spewed forth from our tiny Radio Shack speakers. We were hooked. Right away, the band's opening vamp, laid down by Robert Jr. Lockwood and Luther Tucker on guitars, Lafayette Leak on the Hammond B3 organ, bassist Willie Dixon and Fred Below on drums, cut to the bone. To us, it evoked a world we could only imagine from our vantage point in New England, one in which hypnotically wheezing and clattering trains passed through the vast cotton plantations of the Mississippi Delta and cut through the center of the region's sleepy, racially segregated towns, the tracks separating white neighborhood from black. Over this funky instrumental backdrop, Sonny Boy's harmonica would, one moment, dole out locomotive-inspired staccato accents geared toward bolstering his band's relentlessly rhythmic underpinning, and the next, a hefty, heart-wrenching vibrato as wide as a Mississippi cotton field. The entrance 12 bars later, Williamson's opening line, "You Gotta Help Me," revealed that Sonny Boy's harmonica style, one of the most expressive in recorded blues history, had been designed to mimic closely his rough-edged, chameleon-like voice. Sonny Boy's evocative lyrics, laced with double entendres, expressed not just his individual loneliness, but also the aching solitude felt by all African Americans left homeless and rootless by slavery and its aftermath. Ned and I were utterly defenseless in the face of this beautifully recorded performance of one of American music's deepest singers and instrumentalists, backed by one of the most commanding outfits in rock and roll history. Reared up to then primarily on the likes of Beethoven and Bartók, we realized we had wrongly assumed that this kind of earthy directness and multi-tiered complexity was only possible in classical music. Sonny Boy's expression of isolation also fed directly into our burgeoning worldview, coming of age amidst the turbulent, race-conscious late 1960s. Nightly, we were confronted with television images of the ongoing civil rights struggle beamed into our living room on the evening news. Add to this the influence on us of our chosen bedtime reading, the incendiary black arts movement writings of Leroy Jones and Eldridge Cleaver, so popular at the time. From that moment, my brother and I vowed to learn all we could about blues culture, immersing ourselves in slave songs, spirituals, gospel music, soul music, funk music, and of course, country and urban blues, all the while continuing to study and play classical music. And that first exposure to the blues came full circle almost 30 years later, when that same brother of mine and I made a pilgrimage to Sonny Boy's overgrown and until recently unmarked grave at this abandoned church in Tutwiler, Mississippi. A humble but not altogether unprecedented end to a towering figure in American music. At Brown, I majored in history and Russian language. My true concentration, however, could be more accurately described as leisure, as my main interest during college was to enjoy the personal freedoms that Brown had to offer. I did manage to eke out a couple of hours of piano practice per day in preparation for my weekly lessons in Boston, but the piano during my years here was mostly a solitary endeavor of which most of my friends and professors were utterly unaware. Even my Russian history thesis advisor, Tom Gleason, rightfully miffed by my continued failure to submit a first draft of my honors thesis, said after attending a concerto performance I gave with the Brown Orchestra, "Well, at least you haven't been completely wasting your time." The only other musical constant in my life during college were my regular visits to the sleazy and sometimes menacing bars and nightclubs downtown. Providence in the late 70s had a flourishing local blues scene, and with a built-in audience for this kind of music, was also a major stop for many of the legendary figures on the national blues circuit. During this period, I recall seeing the Louisiana blues pianists Roosevelt Sykes and Professor Longhair, the Kansas City blues shouter Big Joe Turner, and the Chicago bluesman Walter Shaky Horton, Sun Seals, Muddy Waters, and Willie Dixon. One night I ventured down to the Met Cafe, at the time a ramshackle blues box under Route 195, only to find the female Chicago belter Coco Taylor and her band in the middle of an impromptu set. Right here on the Brown campus, I saw the harmonica player James Cotton at Meehan Auditorium, the Texas bluesman Albert Collins at Alumni Hall, and the Chicago bluesman Jimmy Rogers at the Grad Center Bar. All of these musicians are now dead. After graduation, I moved to New York City and somehow managed to get accepted to Juilliard. The only breaks there from class of my 12-hour-a-day practice regimen were the performances I regularly attended at night. When not at Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center, I was scouring all the city's jazz and blues clubs. As a place to hear top-flight jazz, New York, of course, is unparalleled. I would never call it a great blues town, however. Nevertheless, during those early years in New York, virtually every major blues and soul performer eventually made it to either Manhattan or Brooklyn. Suffice it to say, I saw them all. The first years after graduation from Juilliard were spent trying to gather experience and find my voice in the professional world of classical music. After a great deal of self-reflection, what eventually became apparent was that the piano and classical music had become only one of a number of interests that had come to define who I was as a person. Increasingly, I could not envision spending the rest of my life just playing the fantastic 18th, 19th, and early 20th century largely European-based music that up to then had constituted the meat of the piano repertoire and had been performed and recorded so convincingly for generations. As an American musician coming of age in the late 20th and early 21st century, I suspected there was something else that could be done with the piano that had yet to be done, that may be more charged, more relevant to the world in which I now lived, and that best reflected who I was becoming as both an artist and person. Staring me in the face was my childhood and young adulthood steeped in African American culture. Through playing, listening, and reading, completely outside the confines of academia, I had amassed a store of knowledge of Black music, literature, and folklore that, in many ways, rivaled all that I had learned in classical music. Over time, in fact, I'd come to regard this lifelong obsession as more than just an avocation. Legitimately or not, it now felt like an alternative area of expertise and a parallel spiritual home. Although I am not Black and always have had the luxury of being white in a white-dominated society, African American music and culture had become central to my life and identity. The question then became, how was I to combine these dual interests into a performing career? Might there exist an unexplored keyboard repertoire simultaneously drawing from these seemingly disparate fields that was awaiting excavation that would be of musical and cultural interest to both me and the listening public? Was there a continuum of 19th century pianist composers who were either African American or, if not, influenced by early Black culture, who were the forgotten musical ancestors of people like Sonny Boy Williamson and the performers of ragtime, blues, soul, gospel, funk, and rock and roll that have been so formative in my musical development? Indeed, there were, as subsequent fruit-bearing visits to various archives soon bore out. Residing just a subway stop away from my Brooklyn apartment at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center was the leading archive related to Louis Moreau Gottschalk of New Orleans, the first pianist from the New World to achieve international renown, and widely regarded as the first person to compose concert music influenced by African American culture. In the same library, I came face to face with the first piece of sheet music I encountered by Thomas Wiggins, the Georgia slave pianist more popularly known as Blind Tom, and about whom I had read in Eileen Southern's landmark survey, The Music of Black Americans. In her discussion of Wiggins, Southern also mentioned another sightless Black pianist, this one from Missouri, named John William Blind Boone, who had modeled his early career on Blind Tom's. A subsequent trip to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. uncovered a trove of surviving works by both Wiggins and Boone. Looking over these scores, I was struck by how developed this music appeared on the page, in stark contrast to so much other salon music of the era that had been dumbed down for the amateur pianist. The technical demands as well as the range of expression indicated in the printed music of both musicians suggested that these were works of loftier aspiration, intended to be played by high-level amateurs and professionals. More importantly, these pieces were a window into a corner of American culture that, for a host of reasons, had been unfairly relegated to the musical junk heap. Right there and then, I knew I had the makings of at least 2 recordings and related concerts for years to come. Through these woefully unacknowledged figures, I could expose the listening public to a remote corner of the classical repertoire influenced by black culture. Furthermore, the piano for me could now become something more dynamic, no longer an end in itself, but a jumping off point to discuss ongoing issues in an American society still grappling with its segregated past. With the help of my father, a retired Brown professor of medicine now in the rare book business, I began to look for 19th century printed musical African Americana. These books, pieces of sheet music, and other ephemera encompassing African American folk, concert, and theater music would become the primary source material for my ongoing research, as well as supplementary visual imagery from my recordings, writings, and concerts. This quest sent me on countless road trips to remote corners of the United States, during which I met antiquarian book and ephemera dealers, librarians, local amateur historians, and private collectors, conduits to the arcane knowledge and artifacts central to my research. One of them, in fact, Larry Zimmerman, a mathematician and sheet music expert who has amassed one of the most comprehensive archives of early American sheet music in private hands, has been a trusted curatorial consultant for the exhibition here at Brown. My ongoing relationship with Larry and so many other mostly self-taught authorities who operate on the margins of academia has been one of the great joys of my professional life. The printed material I've collected has now become the basis for the exhibition Bambula, Black Music for the Blues, Before the Blues, excuse me. The artifacts on display are presented as the byproduct of a distinctly African American culture, apart from the African culture from which they sprung, and as the printed record of the shared African and European-based musical tradition established in colonial America. The African rhythms, call and response patterns, and the instrumental and vocal techniques imported by the enslaved, when combined with European-based harmonies, performing styles, and secular and religious institutions encountered in the New World, had an enormous influence on the development of much American popular music we take for granted today. And a number of structural and comedic tropes we associate with American theater, film, radio, and television can also be traced to that pariah of the American performing arts and the beginning of show business in the United States, white and black minstrelsy. Numerous studies provide the scholarly framework for the cross-cultural forces informing the musical artifacts on display in the exhibition. One such inquiry was conducted by the eminent literary scholar Shelley Fisher Fishkin. In her book, Was Huck Black?, Fishkin outlines the evolution of the main character in Mark Twain's seminal novel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Twain himself acknowledged that Huck had been modeled on his childhood friend, Tom Blankenship, a white son of a local drunkard in Twain's hometown of Hannibal, Missouri. Utterly astonishing, however, is Fishkin's addendum to Twain's claim. While Blankenship may have been the template for what Fishkin calls, quote, Huck's place in society, the model for Huck Finn's voice, she goes on, was a black child that Twain encountered and subsequently wrote about in an article in the New York Times called Sociable Jimmy. Via a parsing of Huck's language and the vocabulary and syntax used by Jimmy as filtered through Twain, Fishkin methodically shows in her book that Huck's character was of dual racial origin. Fishkin also suggests that, quote, it may have been yet another black speaker who awakened Twain to the power of satire as a tool of social criticism. This other black speaker, Fishkin theorizes, must have been Jerry, an enslaved acquaintance of Twain's, whose oratory imbued with, quote, the African-American folk tradition of signifying satire, Twain regularly listened to for hours on end during his childhood. Through Jerry, Fishkin speculates, Twain gained an appreciation of the African-American trickster tale that lies at the core of his most famous book, one that would have us, quote, revise our understanding of the nature of the mainstream American literary tradition, the voice we have come to accept as the vernacular voice in American literature, the voice with which Twain captured our national imagination in Huckleberry Finn and that empowered Hemingway, Faulkner, and countless other writers in the 20th century, is in large measure a voice that is black. Understanding African American traditions, Fishkin concludes, is essential if one wants to understand mainstream American literary history. And understanding mainstream literary history is important if one wants to understand African American writing in the 20th century. We can no longer deny the mixed literary bloodlines on both sides. Lawrence Levine, in his landmark book Black Culture and Black Consciousness, makes much the same point about Black culture in the mid-19th century. Perhaps at no other point in United States history, he writes, is the term Afro-American a more accurate cultural designation than when it is applied to Black Americans in the mid-19th century. The essence of their thought, their worldview, their culture owed much to Africa, but it was not purely African. It was indelibly influenced by the more than 200 years of contact with whites on American soil, but it was not the product of an abject surrender of all previous cultural standards in favor of embracing those of the white master. This syncretic blend of the old and the new, of the African and the Euro-American, resulted in a style which, in its totality, was uniquely the slaves' own and defined their expressive culture and their worldview at the time of emancipation. For Levine, then, 19th century American Black culture, including music, was a distinct culture apart from African culture, a synthesis of folkways imported by slaves from their homeland and responses to cultural forces encountered by them in the New World. Levine's take was updated 16 years later by the Afro-British philosopher-historian Paul Gilroy. In his 1993 path-breaking treatise, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, Gilroy attempts to refute what the author calls, quote, the continuing lure of ethnic absolutisms and cultural criticism produced both by blacks and by whites through the study of, quote, the stereophonic, bilingual, or bifocal cultural forms originated by, but no longer the exclusive property of blacks dispersed within the structures of feeling, producing, communicating, and remembering that I have heuristically called the Black Atlantic world. For Gilroy, what makes black music black in the Atlantic world is not entirely a matter of race, but also the product of numerous other cultural forces triggered by the African slave trade. The transoceanic contact with mostly European-based cultures during the Middle Passage and in the New World initiated a process of musical transformation that continues to the present day. Bambula, Black Music Before the Blues, speaks directly to this cross-cultural dynamic. The printed musical artifacts on display give voice to the many African-American musicians of the pre-recording era who, mostly lost to history, managed through talent and sheer grit to assimilate into and express themselves artistically in a hostile foreign land. It also attests to the undeniable impact that African-American folk, concert, and theater music has had on the musical output and identities of Americans like me, of European descent. The history of the Black Atlantic, writes Gilroy, continually crisscrossed by the movements of black people, not only as commodities, but engaged in various struggles towards emancipation, autonomy, and citizenship, provides a means to re-examine the problems of nationality, location, identity, and historical memory, and yields a course of lessons as to the instability and mutability of identities, which are always unfinished, always being remade. Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Hello, everyone. It'll be quick. So, good afternoon. I'm honored to participate in this event that celebrates the unique contributions of African Americans to the development of arts and entertainment in the United States, really forming the roots of popular culture. And I want to thank Tony Bogues for inviting me to speak today with John. And also thank you to Jennifer Braga at the library and Maya Rivers at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. for figuring out the logistics of this panel post-snowstorm. And John, I just want to say you have amassed such kind of amazing archival treasures, so I'm looking forward to seeing them, and it's exciting to have the exhibit presented at the John Hay. So much of my current academic research revolves around the questions: what, if anything, does race and racial slavery have to do with stardom? In particular, how can we understand the terms and conditions of African American stardom, the past, present, and future of the terrain of Black celebrity, which I think is sort of an interesting specter of the exhibit, this idea of celebrity. Answering these questions provides another contour to the study of the aesthetics and politics of Blackness, including the fantasies associated with representation and attachments to racial iconicity that are simultaneously can seem incredibly liberating, but also potentially incredibly pernicious. The Star can be considered a spectacular articulation of liberal humanism, in which the individual is the proprietor of his own person and capacities. Thus, the claim to possessive individualism seems always already a problem for the existence of African American stardom due to the legacy of enslavement. As Saidiya Hartman states, and I'm quoting her, "The transubstantiation of the captive into the volitional subject, chattel into proprietor, and the circumscribed body of Blackness into the disembodied and abstract universal seems improbable, if not impossible." In the afterlife of slavery under neoliberalism and late capitalism, the paradoxical quality of such a conversion process can be epitomized by hip-hop artist Kanye West, quote, "Something strange is happening." So I serendipitously stumbled across the story of Thomas Wiggins while doing my dissertation research on race and contemporary fame. In the midst of examining West, various athletes and comedians, as well as assorted social media personalities, I was drawn back to conceptualizations of public persona in entertainment culture in the 19th and early 20th century, a time in which Black American performers expressed themselves and garnered reputations through music and dance on the plantation and beyond. For example, and she is also featured in the exhibit, with her moniker The Black Swan, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield gained success as a singer and even traveled to Europe for shows labeled as a celebrity in the press. So she's going to Europe with Harriet Beecher Stowe, apparently. So, born into slavery on May 25th, 1849, Thomas, the child of Mingo and Charity Wiggins, was without sight and believed to have no labor potential for slave owner and Confederate General James Neal Bethune due to his medical disability. However, it was quickly realized that Thomas had an uncanny fondness for sounds. His musical prowess caught the attention of Bethune, who proceeded to cultivate Wiggins as a concert attraction. Popularly referred to as Blind Tom, he made his stage debut in 1857 in Columbus, Georgia, at the age of 8, and soon began touring the country. Under the staunch anti-abolitionist management, the piano prodigy proved to be a lucrative investment with his improvisatory compositions that astonished audiences. Tom became the first African American to play for the president, then James Buchanan, at the White House, and later in life was even promoted in a playbill as, quote, "the last slave set free by order of the Supreme Court of the United States," until his death in 1908. As one account of the virtuoso asserted, quote, "Tom has been seen probably by more people than any one living being. Those who have observed him most closely and attempted to investigate him most fully pronounce him a living miracle, unparalleled, incomprehensible, such as has not been seen before and probably will never be seen again, end quote. In this account, Tom emerges as a visual curiosity through the account's spectatorial focus on a kind of scopic fascination. Wiggins as a human phonograph, in addition to other enslaved Black folk, such as Millie and Christine McCoy, who I have right here, conjoined twins who P.T. Barnum coined the Carolina Twins and the Two-Headed Nightingale, were thus marketed as freak shows and intensely scrutinized during their public appearances, often a kind of violent sort of scrutiny. Historian Leo Braudy succinctly states that visibility is fame. So what I want to share today are preliminary notes on the status of African American fame and the business of show in relation to the notion of publicity. I'm especially interested in the logics of public exposure associated with Black celebrity. What I call dark optics is informed by Frantz Fanon's understanding of the Black image as an overdetermined category of inquiry in which exposure is configured as crisis. In his 1952 book on colonialism and racism, Black Skin, White Masks, the famous deictic, "Look, a Negro," cited by him in the 5th chapter, references a moment in which the Martinican-born Fanon becomes an object of fixation for a young white child, a fixation that fixes him within an epidermal racial schema. Such a scene reflects a threshold of visibility and visuality that is racialized, indicating the melodramatic appearance of Blackness in the scopic field when encountering the white gaze. Oops. The idea of dark optics aims to think through such an encounter as a form of public relations in order to make larger claims about Black subjectivity in communicative culture. Optics popularly refers to the perception of public appearance. By utilizing Fanon's engagement with and critique of racial representation, I developed dark optics as a theorization of PR. In this way, I worked through communications discourse by taking seriously Fred Moten's provocation that Blackness, quote, can tend and has tended toward the experimental achievement and tradition of an advanced transgressive publicity, end quote. And I should note that for him, publicity in this respect and in other work is really about a kind of fugitivity that's associated with music, sound, and speech acts. And so for me, I'm really trying to think about the optic as tethered to the sonic and vice versa. Publicity involves a set of dynamic relations to the self, to others, and to media technology broadly conceived. Publicity can also be understood as a right, the right of every human being to control the commercial use of his or her identity. In her discussion of the legal concept of property in person, film scholar Jane Gaines provocatively argues that, quote, the legal premise that licensed the slave trade and plantation economics is identical to the doctrine that guarantees new fortunes in celebrity imagery. Taking this rather sort of crude equation seriously, I want to explore its implications for Black celebrity imagery, especially in the current historical moment in which what we might call property in personality underscores the right to publicity or self-promotion. How do these new fortunes that are presupposed by the peculiar institution of slavery manifest in Black entertainment fame? Here I bring to bear the slave as property in person onto racial difference in celebrity culture. In this way, a tension between self-possession and dispossession emerges in African American stardom, instantiated through practices of publicity. And so it's, again, kind of thinking about this question of alienation that I think is really important. So one thing I'm, intrigued by, and why I sort of went down this rabbit hole of sort of going into the work of Thomas Wiggins and whatnot, is that I was interested in sort of trying to understand, how could Tom intervene in such mechanisms of promotion, right? So as the exhibit states, the branding of Wiggins as Blind Tom was designed to elicit audience sympathy as part of the publicity campaign for the young pianist. And so these kind of, productions of this elaborate publicity campaign by his handlers really, incites a level of public captivation that functions as captivity. And if you think about what entertainment means, it means sort of to captivate, right? To sort of hold among and to hold interest. So I emphasize the performative thrust of personality, racialized personality, that produces a captivating body, a gravitational pull for audiences, right? The ability to hold attention within celebrity culture is predicated on a robust publicity machine that keeps one in the public eye as an object of interest. So what makes some famous individuals so magnetic? Certainly charisma, as both an innate disposition and societal construction, contributes to mass appeal. Joseph Roach provides a genealogy of fame and personality-driven mass attraction as the it effect. Roach suggests that, quote, there is a kind of freakishness to having it, and despite the allure, a potential for monstrosity, which haunts the meaning of it as the proper neuter pronoun of the third person singular, used to refer to things without life, of animals when sex is not specified, and sometimes infants, end quote. But absent from his analysis of what it connotes is the status of race and racial difference. Non-human personhood undergirds Black entertainment fame in a trajectory from enslavement to stardom in which the Black subject comes to possess it. In other words, the captivation of the captive. So in Q&A, we can sort of talk about perhaps Thomas Wiggins and the way in which the sort of his autonomy and was always being contested in terms of very particular kinds of managerial sort of processes, whether it be, thinking through his ownership, who owned him when, and who was sort of vying to sort of manage him. And so hopefully we'll sort of talk about that more in that kind of complexity. But I think that Daphne Brooks gives us a good kind of account of thinking about the ways in which Wiggins and others sort of, exemplify or have these moments where they have sort of lines of flight where they can kind of imagine what she calls the poetics of the sonic slave narrative, the soundscape of enslavement, its multi-century dimensions, and how that sort of exemplify through Thomas's performances. So Black performers such as Burt Williams and others capitalized on minstrelsy as the most popular entertainment genre in American culture and further advanced their acting, singing, and dancing careers. The emergence of mass media forms and the development of screen culture, film, and later television orients Blackness differently in the public eye. And so I really want to sort of think about the way in which, what difference does the screen make, and sort of the advent of consumer culture when we're talking about issues of Black music and particularly in terms of performance and ultimately stardom. For example, in his seminal study of Paul Robeson's fame, Richard Dyer accounts for how African-American cinematic stardom became permissible in Hollywood during the first half of the 20th century. Utilizing Robeson's circulation in entertainment culture, Dyer accounts for the discursive conditions of possibility by which Robeson was allowed to cross over in his appeal to both Black and white audiences, who produced disparate readings of his screen image. Additionally, Miriam Petty's work on early Black star performers who stole the show in cinema through enactment of strategic expressions that allowed them to retain autonomy both on and off screen. Also consider someone like Lena Horne, who was considered the NAACP's crisis cover girl, who signed to a studio contract, but whose scenes were actually omitted in some Southern cinemas due to issues concerning race relations. So how do we understand the screen and the advent of commodity culture in relation to Black fame? So I first read Amiri Baraka's Blues People with Tony Bogues, who kept telling me it was the prototypical cultural studies text. And I just wanted to read a couple of quotes from the last couple of pages where he says, quote, "Negro music is always radical in the context of formal American culture." And then he ends on the last page by saying that the American Negro is being asked to defend the American system as energetically as the American white man. There is no doubt the middle-class Negro is helping and will continue to help in that defense. So in a 2013 Saturday Night Live NBC appearance, hip-hop artist Kanye West performed his track New Slaves, which included a screen behind him that rapidly projected a succession of images resembling vintage price tags from half price to not for sale. The song describes the intoxication of consumer culture for African Americans, commenting on how the desire for material wealth amongst Blacks manifests itself as a form of slavery. As Tommy J. Curry suggests, the record, quote, introduced a pessimistic terminology to capture the paradoxical condition whereby Black freedom from enslavement only resulted in the capturing of Black people psychically in the neoliberal entanglements of poverty, servitude, and corporatism. At the same time, the hip-hop song ruminates on West's own fame and his antagonistic ties to the US entertainment enterprise. He critiques corporations in the rap, attesting that such business entities cannot control him, and lyrically threatens to relocate his family out of the country due to the encroachment on his privacy by the mechanisms of star surveillance. West performs New Slaves in virtual stillness, not moving from his position on stage. And visually, the play between foreground and background allow the rappers to be enveloped by darkness at the same time that he occupies the spotlight. The SNL musical act conveys a message about the brands of commodification offered up by new slavery as well as stardom. The screen image prompts audiences to question what is and is not for sale. The overall performance allows for a consideration of who has the capacity to own and profit from the Black star image. No other African American entertainer in recent memory circulates in media culture like West, a veritable public relations nightmare. Named one of Time magazine's most influential people in the world in 2015, the icon grabs attention and makes headlines with his infamous antics and larger-than-life persona. West navigates stardom through performative errantry across visual and sonic registers. His complex relationship to celebrity reveals the threshold of exposure for African American entertainers within current media culture. He does not just diverge from the script in his mediated relations to the public, but rather demonstrates a calculated nonsense that simultaneously attracts and repels audiences. Frequently deviating from the proper standards of stardom, his errantry is epitomized by his aesthetic choices. Daphne Brooks conceptualizes the Afro-Alienation Act as a performance tactic of Black entertainers in which expressivity is a radical operation that calls attention to historical racial oppression. the performance in its illegibility or spectacular opacity becomes a method of disorienting and reorienting Blackness in the field of vision. West's dissonant star image across screen culture exemplifies such a strange mode of visibility and visuality that also operates on the level of the sonic. Once describing his work as sonic paintings, West emphasizes the centrality of visuality to his music and relies on the experience of synesthesia, a melding of the senses, in this case seeing sound, for his artistic practice. Sometimes electronically manipulated to their limits, his vocals extend beyond legibility. Such jarring linguistic indeterminacy produces disruptive utterances that complicate common sense through excessive equivocation. So West is a figure that I analyzed in my first book project, so promo here, Dark Optics, Blackness, Exposure, and Celebrity in Media Culture. On December 13th of this past year, West was photographed in the lobby of Trump Hotel with President Donald Trump, who has even likened himself to P.T. Barnum in a past interview. In the midst of the flashing lights and clicking cameras, West only makes one remark, quote, "I just wanted to take a picture," end quote. So I'm really interested in this moment in terms of this kind of photo opportunity and what I'm sort of understanding as a kind of crisis of screen personality that's manifested through these kind of promotional mechanisms. Public image has been central to African American identity and experience in US culture and society. From Frederick Douglass's status as most photographed person in the 19th century, to the ubiquitous display and influence of Beyonce Knowles in current popular media, the cultivation of public image in all arenas of life became a way for Black Americans to see themselves in a symbolic world order. Yet as Bell Hooks has also noted, we experience our collective crisis as African Americans within the realm of the image. The book is an intervention into the study of race and representation. It engages with crises in representation and the structuring of publicity when confronted with racial difference by focusing on the contemporary mass-mediated Black celebrity subject. I argue that understandings of public image and public exposure are complicated by Blackness in the headlines, and particularly by the dark optics of publicity. If celebrity largely centers on the idea of being known in its logics of exposure, I argue that this poses a crisis of ontology and epistemology for the Black subject. The book takes up this problematic paradigm of revelation and concealment, analyzing famous individuals, popular performances, and memorable moments in the early 21st century US television and digital media culture, in order to demonstrate the multiple ways in which Blackness comes to be fashioned and managed or mismanaged in the limelight. Thomas Wiggins perplexed audiences in his Alterity on Stage. Returning to this early material history of Black celebrity may be useful in the hopes that we can find resonances with the current multi-mediated environment with, as West states, our now inside of the TV. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John and Brandy. We have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. Show of hands, please. Question and answer, Q&A.
Well, I'd like to make an observation. I thought John was brilliant. And I want to make sure that you are going to publish it.
Oh, no one's asked me, but I'm always open to it.
Okay. Let me get. Yes, please, go ahead.
So,
Can you just say who you are if you don't mind?
Ray Rickman, citizen. So I went to, so Ciceretta Jones fought the establishment, integrated. She's the reason that movie houses, blacks got to sit in the balcony. Before her, Black people could not come in. So she's an exception to your, I'm sorry, and she, whatever they'd offer her, she'd ask for double. So she's the first black woman to ever do that. She's the Aretha Franklin of her day. And as you know, the 6 blocks from here. So she's an exception to everything you're saying?
Yeah, I think that there's a way in which I'm trying to understand sort of the terrain of black celebrity as a concept, and so trying to sort of think through the ways in which we even sort of come to understand what it means to be known in terms of racial subjects, right? So I think that there are definitely these, figures that we can point to that that integrate and do it successfully and don't necessarily have a sort of, moment of crisis. But I then wonder, how we're understanding, their how we're understanding sort of racial difference in that moment, right? Whether or not, figures like Beyonce, for example, that are sort of invested in a particular kind of capitalism, if that is somehow different from just the idea of what sort of black stardom actually is, right? So I think that, and there are other figures. I think that there's a really interesting kind of idea being presented by some sort of figures where, there was one episode where Chris Rock kind of talks about how one is famous versus a black famous. So there are all these different kinds of, categories that we can sort of think about in terms of how sort of one's racial identity is operating in these different moments, or, in terms of crossover appeal and whatnot.
So is there, may I?
Can
Of
I
course, yeah.
respond to what you originally said?
Yes.
Yes, maybe Sister Rhoda Jones was able to sort of exert some influence in her own career, but don't forget that the reason she joined Black Patty's Troubadours was she was completely left out of the opera world, and she never was able to get an engagement at any opera company anywhere in the world, and so was left to actually join a kind of quasi-minstrel black vaudeville troupe as the headliner, which did become hugely successful, but her real dream was to be in a legitimate opera production either in Europe or the United States, from which he was completely basically exiled.
Tony, I wanted to
Yeah,
ask,
go ahead, Ray.
There's so she's a civil rights figure, really, and in every era, there's only so far you can go, because you can only go so far. People have strange views about civil rights. 16-year-olds shouldn't be able to vote, and I know they will be able to vote. So we're very strange and slow people. But I think there's a date. It may be Berry Gordy. Seriously, who doesn't get his credit? But you have Ray Charles and everybody going back. They're only black, and they can't. White people, you can't even buy a record from Ray Charles in most stores in America, including Providence. So is there a date to what you're talking about? That at some date, white people quit stealing black people's music with impunity, and Berry Gordy brings legal. He beats the hell out of everybody.
Yeah.
And then black folks are different?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an interesting question. In terms of a date, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I'm also thinking about Prince and his catalog and the way in which that has been mobilized or not after his death. But I think that, part of this for me comes back to issues of media technology and sort of the ways in which with the emergence of sort of digital media, the way in which we encounter race has fundamentally shifted. And so not only race, but other, other things. So I think that there's an interesting sort of, post-civil rights era, terrain that we haven't quite yet figured out, if that makes sense.
Okay.
One reference to, now that
Yeah.
you brought up Berry Gordy, I would argue that, I mean, one reason this music became so popular across the board was basically he, rightly or wrongly, he streamlined soul music in a way that was much less sort of church-oriented and much more designed to appeal to a larger audience. So if you listen to Motown songs, there's much less of this sort of church style of singing and also the instrumental backdrop, and that was one of his brilliant touches in terms of commercialism, whatever you think of aesthetically of that music versus the music that was being put out by Atlantic Records and also some of the so-called race records in the South. But he was very smart that way to be able to make this appealing to a wider audience.
Yeah.
Also, one of you brought up the issue of whites, the history of whites stealing from blacks. I think as a musician, that's a kind of a murky terrain. I mean, there's no doubt that this was going on all through recorded history, that white producers were co-opting black songs and having them remade by white people. But I mean, the history of actually borrowing music, and this is a central thing at least in Western culture, is a tried and true tradition that began, way back in the Baroque period and even before with people like Bach. So musicians themselves actually don't always look at it as a kind of as a stealing, but this kind of co-opting of other music they hear is just part and parcel of being a musician. The degree that it was being done by record companies was outrageous, obviously, in the lack of payment and all this kind of stuff. And this even goes on today. And personally, I've also been the victim of this myself with my own recordings. So I feel this very strongly, that people need to be given credit, they need to be paid for this, and that was not being done. But the actual act of sort of taking somebody else's song or covering it, assuming you get permission for this and you pay them for this, to me is not in itself a horrible thing. It's a tried and true tradition that's also goes on to the present day.
Yes, please, at the back.
Hi, thank you both for your wonderful presentations. This question is more so for Brandy. I was really interested in this relationship between the optic and the sonic that you were talking about. And you mentioned Daphne Brooks' idea of soundscapes of enslavement, and I think also, you can add in folks like Tina Campt and how she's really, looking at photographs in the archive through the lens of the sonic. And so I was wondering how might sound be a useful kind of methodological approach when kind of rethinking blackness in the archive or moments of resistance. So like from, the photograph of Thomas Wiggins, like what moments of resistance might we read from that to the last photograph that you showed with Donald Trump and Kanye West. So just really thinking about like the sonic and the optic.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I mean, it's something that, I've been trying to sort of navigate, because I'm very interested in, particularly in terms of understanding sort of, public relations as a communicative practice. When you think about sound, you think about speech acts mostly. You think about sort of, particular kinds of sort of press releases or sorts of, moments. I think about sort of, Janet Jackson's sort of videotape topology, for the Super Bowl performance. So it's a question that I definitely want to sort of delve into. I think that those images are so striking in terms of, the stance, right, of the figures, and I'm wondering if there's something about their sort of body in these photos that can, speak in some respects, and sort of have that kind of, sonic materiality to them that perhaps exceeds, a kind of, rote sort of reading, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could go back to a quote that you had, that minstrels are like a racial unconscious. If you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I would actually like to, if you don't mind, speak to it in reference to some of the discussions, not so much about minstrels, if you don't mind, but into discussions around cultural appropriation and also around Motown. To say that it might be useful to think about not stealing, but a certain form of cultural appropriation which actually takes place. That there is, talking now somebody like who was a musician myself, that there is an exchange with, which all musicians, writers, various people actually engage in. But there is also a moment in which, given the racial organization of American society, that there is a way in which that a lot of that music is not recognized and seen as a quote-unquote music, but is seen as noise or something else. And that what happens is the process of mainstreaming, not what Barry Gordy does, which we can talk about in a minute, but that the actual process of mainstreaming is a form of cultural appropriation that then allows us to have the mainstream to have a certain kind of ease with the music without the racial understanding. So there's a racial, quote-unquote, unconsciousness of that. So a figure like Presley becomes critical. Rock and roll becomes seen as in the mainstream as a white American music without an understanding of its roots in black culture. So that there is a way in which we might want to just think about this racial unconsciousness, which as I said, is, and I wish Eric was here, is really not unconscious. It is just that it is not upfront, but it is actually the frame in which we operate. But it goes by, it passes us by because we take it for granted. And in relationship to Barry and stuff, I would just want to say that we might want to, the way in which strings were used, violins, Lamont Dozier and all of those folks who was doing this kind of music, that in the South there was also something called stacks. Those of us who know a man called Isaac Hayes would want to know where does Hayes come from. And there is that, and in Memphis, Tennessee, the music in which which comes out of the South, in which the strings are there, in which a certain kind of church is transformed into soul. Because I actually think that Barry doesn't transform church at all. Is that the actual roots of the African American church then gets reorganized itself in a certain kind of secular singing. But secularism and secular singing was always, and secular music was always part of the African African American tradition. And that there is no, you don't understand an Aretha without understanding the profound effect, of being in the black church. You don't understand a Mavis Staple, and her song "I Will Take You There," without not understanding the deep roots in the African American church. So that is what I'm trying to suggest is that there's no great rupture, right? There is a different form that emerges, that people play with. There's a certain kind of elasticity around the sonic that occurs within the black tradition. But that elasticity has its roots. I would argue, certain kind, what Du Bois would call sour songs, and within those sour songs, the actual institution if you wish, of the black church, is where all of this is taken. So one of the things I would love to hear Brandy talk about later on is the way in which you can now go to a gospel concert and how that gospel, the performance of that gospel concert is not fundamentally different from a Beyonce in many many ways. The dress is different and so on, and but that there is a way in which the apparatus of the actual concert itself it draws from a certain kind of way in which
Worship, yeah.
entertainment is now organized. So that's how I would answer your question.
In fact, if you take, one of my favorite soul singers is a guy named O.V. Wright, who for High Records, and he has a song called 8 Men and 4 Women, That's the Jury of Love. And in the middle of it is a section where he starts talking, and it's basically mimicking the cadence of an African American preacher and so there's no overt reference to this, but if you've heard any of these things, you go like, oh, well, that's directly from a church service, really, and yet there's no reference to Jesus or anything. It's all in the context of love and what the secularizing of African American music.
So I want to respond and then ask some questions. I want to respond to John, your comment about stealing. I don't know if you meant it like this or that it wasn't stealing. And then I appreciate Professor Bogues' comment on cultural appropriation. But I, having done a lot of work in music, in undergrad, there's this conversation about speaking to each other. The music spoke to each other. And that's not what happened through the power dynamics when non-black people use the music. So in the blues, it was, I'm going to take this one chord and then play with it and argue with it and have a conversation with it. And that's not what happened. So it really was I would say a theft, and I appreciate
entire
that
songs, you're saying. Yeah.
I'm saying entire songs, I'm saying entire verses, and so it seems like a co-opting of the idea, or a whitewashing when you say it, of telling a story, when the fact is that it was literally music was being stolen, and it wasn't about giving money. It was literally the erasure of an entire genre given to a group that was not the person that created it. And it's important to acknowledge who created this kind of knowledge, this kind of work, and the history from it. So there isn't a European history in any of the Europe that I know that traces back to the lineage of the kind of music that was stolen and then reappropriated to the white population. And so that's my response to that. And then I have a question about bringing together the work that you all do. When we're thinking about like looking through music and looking through the sonic, if there wasn't an optic image, if we're looking at dark optics, would there still be the same kind of narrative, right? So if we could hear the conversation between Trump and President Trump and Kanye, if we didn't know their voices, if they weren't racialized, if their voices weren't racialized and we didn't know who they were, would the conversation or would the music or the way that we interpret them be different? There's been some like experimental work done at Yale about it, but just like it doesn't have strong theory. So just what do you think there's a theoretical intervention that can happen when we take out the optics and only think about the sonic and that is not racialized? Is there a certain way that certain people like?
Before you all answer, it's 3:30. Can we take one more question so that we just have a clutch of questions? If there's one more person that has a burning thing they want to ask. Okay, so John.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of this, is sort of emerging from this idea of the sort of to sort of potentially sort of evacuate the kind of optic, that I think is historicized through sort of Obama and sort of a post-racial moment, right? I don't know if we can do that anymore. Like, I actually don't know if we can separate the two in that way. I mean, I'm very invested in sort of the audiovisual, so that would be my like preliminary answer to you. But I think that there's a way in which the myth of the post-racial has now been sort of, you know, aired out to the extent that, you know, to just sort of think about these sort of two icons irrespective of it, right? Like, yeah, I don't know how that would work, but I'll think about it.
John?
I was just sort of curious how it's different, the celebrity, if you're sort of a current celebrity versus white versus black, how the situation might be different if you're white versus black, and how it shows up for a black person comes differently, the kind of sort of societal enslavement or something that comes from celebrity.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, like that comes in these kind of moments, interestingly, you know, in terms of cultural appropriation, where you kind of have these moments on social media where you have, you know, particular contemporary celebrities who are calling each other out, right? Like based on, you know, various issues of, you know, appropriation, whether that be kind of Miley Cyrus and you know, and Nicki Minaj, or other kinds of sort of feuds, and that becomes another kind of mechanism by which to sort of think through the aesthetics and politics of blackness.
Interesting.
Okay, can we just give our panelists a round of applause, please?